President-elect Trump channels an American Caesar, eyeing bold moves to reshape the map, reclaiming the Panama Canal, buying Greenland, and even making Canada the 51st state. It sounds like Trumpian bluster, but could it signal a grand strategy to expand US power, control global trade routes, and secure national security well into the 21st century?
In a marathon news conference at Mar-a-Lago, President-elect Trump not ruling out using economic or military coercion to retake the Panama Canal and acquire Greenland.
And we gave the Panama Canal to Panama. We didn't give it to China. Our military is at their disposal. All of these other things, they should be a state.
Let's start with the Panama Canal. Trump slammed Panama for charging what he calls ridiculous, unfair fees to US ships, suggesting that the canal should be taken back by the US. For context, tolls for large container ships average $450,000, with some paying up to $1 million to cut the line, bringing in $3 billion a year, or about 6% of Panama's total economy. But Trump's real target here isn't Panama. It's China. But before we get into the contemporary standoff between the US and China, let's go back and look at some history. The 1914 completion of the canal showcased the rapid rise of American power and fulfilled the vision of Alfred Thayer Mann, an American geostrategist, who argued in the late 19th century that a Central American canal network would be key to the United States' control of the world's oceans, enabling rapid movement of naval forces between the Atlantic and the Pacific. The United States secured control of the Panama Canal project by purchasing failed French efforts, including equipment and excavation sites, for $40 million in 1904. After abandoning plans for a Nicaraguan canal, the United States shifted focus to Panama, swayed by strategic lobbying and geography. To ensure control, the United States backed Panama's independence from Colombia, deploying warships to deter Colombian forces. Within days of declaring independence, Panama signed the Ay Bunau Varilla Treaty, granting the US control over the canal zone, cementing American influence in the region. The canal remained under American control until President Jimmy Carter's 1977 treaty, which handed it over to Panama in 1999. This decision sparked fierce opposition, with a Gallup poll at the time showing 55% of Americans opposed the transfer. Critics, including Senators Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms, labeled it one of the greatest blunders of the 20th century, arguing the US had sacrificed control over a vital trade artery constructed for American effort and sacrifice. The canal is still pretty vital for the US economy, as nearly 40% of US container traffic flows through it. Historically, the canal was also key to US military strategy. During both World Wars and Vietnam, it allowed swift movement of naval forces and supplies, with nearly 90% of Vietnam-bound ammunition passing through. Though its military utility has diminished, as modern carriers are too large for its locks, the canal remains a critical lifeline for US military logistics, and in the event of a war with China, for supporting key allies like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan with essential fuel and resources. The canal's reliance on predictable rainfall and the looming threat of attacks on its dams, like the critical Gatun Dam, further highlight its fragility. But it's very unlikely that China would encourage terrorist attacks on a country that is so heavily invested in. China has poured over $4 billion into Panamanian infrastructure since 2017, backing highways, bridges, and the Panama City Metro. It now runs two key ports on either side of the canal, Balboa on the Pacific and Cristobal on the Atlantic, while the Landbridge Group's $900 million acquisition of Margarita Island Port adds a deep water port facility for megaships, boosting China's shipping clout. They also snagged a $1.4 billion deal to build a fourth bridge over the canal, but delays have bogged that project down. Still, we're a long way from Chinese soldiers being stationed on the canal, as Trump has suggested. Panama's leadership has firmly rejected his criticisms, defending the canal's tolls as transparent and market-aligned. Since its return to Panamanian control in 1999, the canal has become a powerful symbol of national pride. President Jose Raul Mulino made Panama's position clear, declaring the canal belongs to Panama and will remain so. Meanwhile, the United States remains active in Panama with projects aimed at the canal's pressing challenges. One initiative involves releasing genetically modified worms to control invasive aquatic plants known as Salvinia molesta. This fast-growing species clogs waterways, disrupts canal operations, and endangers local ecosystems. The US has also supported efforts to address the canal's reliance on rainfall, which is becoming increasingly unpredictable. With the locks consuming approximately 60 million gallons of water daily, droughts threaten the canal's ability to sustain global trade flows. So, Trump's remarks risk straining this $12 billion US-Panamanian trade relationship, and ironically could push Panama closer into China's orbit, causing disruptions to this major piece of the global supply chain. So unlike the Panama Canal, the United States has never owned Greenland outright. However, it has long been interested in the territory, with Trump's 2019 and 2024 proposals merely being the latest attempts. Calling it strategically interesting, Trump suggested buying the island from Denmark, which sparked outrage in both Denmark and Greenland, with the Prime Minister of Greenland making it clear that the island was not for sale. However, the idea is not without historical precedence. Secretary of State William Henry Seward considered buying Greenland and Iceland after acquiring Alaska in 1867 to bolster American Arctic influence. Trump has merely reignited the discussion, describing US ownership as an absolute necessity and backing it with diplomatic moves. During World War II, Greenland and Iceland were key to securing the UK Gap, about which we have a more detailed video. Britain occupied Iceland in 1940 to block Axis control, while Greenland became a refueling station and hosted US military bases under the Greenland Defense Agreement. After the war, the US even offered Denmark $100 million in gold for Greenland, but Copenhagen declined. The Cold War merely increased Greenland's importance as a vital Arctic outpost for NATO, with SOSUS sonar tracking Soviet subs and Tula Air Base, now Pitufik Space Base, serving as a hub for missile defense, satellite tracking, and Arctic surveillance. At its peak, Tula housed nuclear weapons and thousands of personnel, cementing Greenland's strategic importance. The US still operates Pitufik today, underscoring its enduring role in Arctic security. Greenland's role in controlling the GI-UK gap is key, but its importance is growing as the ice melts. The Northwest Passage, once blocked by ice, is set to rival the Panama and Suez Canals as a major trade route during the 21st century. If the United States controls both ends, Alaska and Greenland, it could dominate the passage and decide its use. This echoes William Seward's vision that owning Greenland and Alaska might even convince Canada to join the United States voluntarily. Perhaps even more important, though, is the fact that Greenland sits on 38.5 million tons of rare earth oxides, making it a potential global leader in critical minerals essential for batteries, wind turbines, and defense systems. With over 60% of rare earth production and 85% of refining controlled by China, Greenland's untapped resources offer a way to reduce US reliance on Beijing. In the past decade alone, exploration licenses for rare earths in Greenland have jumped 40%, and Greenland has even shifted its focus, suspending oil and gas exploration licenses in 2021 to prioritize mining and diversify an economy heavily reliant on fishing and subsidies from Denmark. Major projects are already underway. The Kvanefjeld mine, owned by Australia's Greenland Minerals Limited with Chinese investment, holds 11 million tons of rare earths like neodymium and praseodymium, critical for wind turbines and electric vehicles. The Kringlerne or Tanbreeze deposit, owned by Tanbreeze Mining, is even richer, containing zirconium, hafnium, and light rare earths. Meanwhile, the Isua iron ore project, controlled by China's General Nice, adds secondary rare earth deposits to Beijing's growing control of Greenland's resources. And if the Panama Canal and Greenland weren't enough, Trump has floated the idea of turning Canada into the 51st state, calling its taxes far too high and suggesting Wayne Gretzky should run for Prime Minister. However, Trump isn't the first to suggest closer ties between the US and Canada. Diane Francis, in her book Merger of the Century, advocates for uniting the two nations, arguing they'd form an economic powerhouse larger than the EU or China, with unmatched natural resources like Canada's 15 trillion in untapped metals and minerals, and the US's culture of innovation and technology. She also highlighted the Arctic's potential as the world's future Panama and Suez canals, unlocking massive economic opportunities. But while Francis envisions unity, analyst Peter Zion predicts Canada could fracture under regional tensions. Western provinces, rich in resources, frequently clash with Ottawa over policies they view as favouring the East, fueling movements like Wexit. Meanwhile, Quebec's French-speaking separatist ambitions remain an enduring challenge. Canada's scattered population along its southern border complicates national cohesion, amplifying regional grievances and weakening economic centralization. Peter Zion warns that a fragmented Canada could struggle to manage its vast natural wealth and Arctic territory. This would leave it vulnerable to foreign influence, particularly from China, or perhaps overly dependent on the United States. Zion argues Alberta would thrive as a US state, given its immense energy wealth, producing more oil and gas than the rest of Canada combined, with 165 billion barrels of reserves, the third largest in the world. Alberta's economy, already tied to the US, exports 96% of its crude oil south, contributing to its high GDP per capita, driven by energy, agriculture, and tech sectors. Known as the Texas of the North, Alberta's fiscal conservatism and resource-focused policies align more closely with US conservative states than with Canada's federal government. Zion suggests its younger population and resource wealth make it a prime candidate for statehood, potentially the richest in America. However, support for joining the US remains low. A 2019 Angus Reid poll found only 25% of Albertans backed the idea, while 62% opposed. Despite frustrations with Ottawa, most Albertans favour staying in Canada and pursuing provincial reforms over secession or US statehood. While the idea of Alberta or Canada joining the US is highly unlikely, the deep ties between the two nations make such a union unnecessary. The US and Canada share the world's largest bilateral trade relationship, with $680 billion in trade flowing between them annually. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of energy to the US, providing 62% of its crude oil imports, while the US is Canada's biggest trading partner, accounting for 75% of Canadian exports. With shared defense agreements like NORAD and integrated economies, the two countries already function as closely aligned allies, proving that a formal merger isn't needed. If the US absorbed Canada and Greenland, GDP could hit $30 trillion, lowering the debt-to-GDP ratio from 125% to around 117%. Still high, but a notable boost to America's economic clout. Trump's plans for Panama, Greenland, and Canada echo a modern Monroe Doctrine, framing them as counters to Chinese and maybe Russian influence and part of a broader strategy to secure US trade and security. Yet, these plans come with risks, potentially alienating allies like Denmark, which has already increased its military presence in Greenland. Realistically, it's unlikely any of these territories will join the US anytime soon. But it's important to understand the historical background and geopolitical strategy that underpins such thinking.